Brad, you want to start?
Well, I don't think that the American Occupy activists are preoccupied with the socialist alternative, as I understand that phrase. I think they are preoccupied with alternatives. And some of the alternatives that they are examining and that they are sympathetic to are not the traditional socialist alternatives at all, but rather they are the alternative forms of cooperative economic enterprise that have flourished for moments, at least, in the 19th century. They are into economic innovation and different ways that people can work together to produce and to circulate the goods and services that are needed by a complex cooperative society. I have no inclination to impose on this discussion, this examination, the language of the 19th and the 20th century. I say, let it go. It's interesting. It's good. I myself, I am not a revolutionary. I have to say this because I just said it to Leo for about the third or fourth time, I think, earlier today. I think that it takes all we've got just to force reforms grudgingly out of a hyper-capitalist society. Revolution frightens me because I don't think we know what happens after we topple the state. I don't think we know the next steps. I was as romantically infatuated with the young Egyptians in Tahrir Square as anyone was, but I kept worrying about the military. And sure enough, the protests subsided as they inevitably do, and the military gains the upper hand in Egyptian society. So I'm for movements. I'm for reformist movements. I think reformist movements have to be very militant and very disruptive. I think that we usually hold on to some of the results of those reforms. And beyond that, I don't know.
Fair.
I'm going to take the easy part first. The easy part is the question about sectarianism, because here I'm just right with Marx's classic statement on this. The sectarian puts the interests of their particular group, current, what have you, above the needs of the movement. Okay? For me, that's the right definition. And there's a lovely statement that Engels later gave about what he and Marx did in 1848 in Germany, where Engels said, we could have set up our own little corner shop, okay, and propagated our doctrine. But there was a mass upheaval happening. And we positioned ourselves as the left wing of the existing movement. And that idea that our task is to figure out how to be the left wing of the existing movement. To be the left wing does not mean you simply tell everybody, great job. That's terrific. You have to pose important questions. But it is the way in which you do it. Is it sniping from the sidelines and telling everybody that you've really got it best, and if they just leave their mass movement and come join your little corner group, that everything would be perfect? Or is it done by way of raising experientially, as the movement encounters real problems and difficulties, raising discussions about where these are coming from, what the contradictions of our movement is, how we might think about moving them forward, and so on. Now, I'm of a different generation than Paul, And so, you know, my reaction is somewhat different when I see, for example, several thousand young people occupying St. James Park the first day we all walked in there on the demonstrations. My first reaction was delight. Most demonstrations I go to in this city, I know the majority of people there. Okay? When I walked into St. James Park, I didn't know most people. And that was good. That was really good. Because one of our problems is that we're often very good or just, you know, pathologically dysfunctional about talking to one another. We know our disagreements, we argue to our blue in the face, so on. The left needs the challenge once again of relating to thousands and thousands of people who haven't come out of the left, who are coming into anti-austerity struggles and so on. And that creates huge, huge new challenges, but they're the challenges we need. Because it means getting out of our old habits and the ways in which we talk and argue with one another, and really thinking about what does it mean to make radical, sorry Fran, even revolutionary socialism relevant in those discussions. So I agree, lots of people who come in to struggle for the first time don't automatically see themselves as socialists. But I think socialists have a lot to offer those struggles, and when you do that, it raises questions of where's this analysis coming from, where's this strategy and tactics coming from, what's this analysis, why is it anti-capitalist, and so on. And again, I think if we're thinking in a longer term perspective, then the fact that where people start isn't necessarily on the same page as us needn't be terribly discouraging, because if we really have the confidence that we have something meaningful, significant, and important to say and contribute, then let's get in there, work alongside people who have all kinds of different ideas, and offer up in a very principled, straightforward, but not haranguing way what socialists have to contribute.
I wonder if I could say something to this. I was rather dismayed on May Day, since this is part of the May Day celebration, this event, to see that in this very lively and creative protest and then march, where I too felt very much, David, that I wasn't able to recognize the majority of faces, and that was such a good thing to feel as one goes to something on the left in the city. I couldn't help but remark, and I commented on this in an earlier panel today, on how poor the representation was from the labor movement, and especially from the public sector unions. And I spoke to a number of people from the Labor Council about this today, and the answer was that there are really two cultures going on here. And the two cultures are suspicious of each other. And that culture, the culture thing is the word culture is important because it is about the way people dress and the way they march, and there's a certain zeitgeist that is certainly evident in the Occupy movement and has been evident on the left for the last dozen or more years, and that is the suspicion of organization in the sense in which the sit-down strikes of the 30s both were produced by and gave rise to the types of working class organizations which are very not, in terms of the way they were organized, not what the majority, or at least a large significant portion of the unspoken leadership of Occupy have in mind. But I think that Paul's question, and that's something that's going to have to be addressed and dealt with, and a labor movement that is isolated from this movement, as it appeared to be partly the case this last week here in Toronto, is going to be in big trouble. That said, it seems to me Paul's raising another question that cannot be avoided, and that we have to address. And that is that if the crisis is the fourth great crisis of capitalism, if it is an outcome of the contradictions of this incredibly dynamic and expansive 30, 40 years of capitalism, we can't just be pushing for disruption and reform. I don't think that it's serious to do so. If we're going to try to find a long-term strategic way out of the type that David was pointing to. And realistically, I mean, what can one say except we need to recommit ourselves to the possibility of democratic economic planning, to democratizing the decisions about what's invested, where it's invested, who's employed, what the division of labor is, or how do we overcome that division of labor. Those are the classic socialist questions. And to a certain extent, the rhetoric of Occupy avoids it. It avoids it, and therefore you get Ron Paul enthusiasts showing up, as well as people who want economic planning, want to see the banks turn to the public utilities. And the rhetoric is so wonderful because it can span all of that. And yet if we're serious about what we're going to do in this crisis, that is going to have to be addressed, and some debates are going to have to be had. And some divisions, hopefully of a non-sectarian kind, will come to the fore around that question. Do we get rid of the Federal Reserve? Is that the problem? Right. Or do we turn the banks into public utilities as the beginning of a process of democratic economic planning? Those are the classic socialist questions in part, apart from the ones of how does the labor movement link up to protest movements, which are far more dynamic and inventive. So it's a crucial question, and I think it does have to do with where Occupy leads now.
So one qualification, in Ottawa this year, which they had a teaching on austerity, the Alliance funded much of the day of May Day, which was the best May Day in Ottawa for decades. Of course, there was a good turnout because it was also the day that 7,000 employees got their firing notices. And so there was a real militancy and anger in the air. It's easy to get angry at Harper as well. So.
Looking at the May Day event in Toronto and saying, where is the labor movement? And I think there's truth to this idea that there are different political cultures in, we'll call the youth-based movement and the labor-based movement. And I think it poses strategic problems for both camps, if I can put it in these terms, which is basically that without a genuine integration and synthesis of working class struggle and youth-based struggle, both are coming up against incredible dead ends. I mean, I'll give you, my experience of going to some recent labor rallies, and here, Mick, geographic sectionalism, but also the incredible public-private sector divide. I mean, the recent Ontario Federation of Labour rally at Queen's Park, my observation was 80% teachers. Okay, that's who was there. Okay, and very, very little presence outside that. I similarly went in January to the Ontario Federation of Labour's rally against Caterpillar's EMD plant, and I think we all know how that ended. And I was really struck by several things. First, it's boring, guys. It's boring in really freezing winter in southwestern Ontario to stand out there, and lots of us had kids with us, and hear the head of every union there having to speak. Okay? And that's just boring. Okay? Never mind the fact the sound system couldn't even be heard by most people. We'll leave that aside. Okay? But then, one speaker and one speaker alone basically says what all the radicals in the crowd are thinking. He says, we've got to occupy the workplace. Herman wrote about this later. In other words, who marched on the plant? Occupy London marched on the plant. But the labor rally didn't. Okay? And so the labor movement desperately needs some of the energy, some of the dynamism, some of the defiance, the willingness to push the envelope that you find in the youth-based movements. But the youth-based movements have to figure out a way to connect with working class activists, not just to be a youth-based movement. This has been a strategic problem of new lefts of recent generations. And until we get that happening, I think we're at we're kind of at a strategic dead end until we can draw significant numbers of rank and file workers and youth radicals into common movements where they're strategizing together, working together, learning from one another, we're going to have this problem. But I think because Leo raised the labor movement, we've got to be honest about what a labor rally does, where it leaves you freezing cold listening to every labor leader there, and then you're supposed to get in your car and go home. And that's why apparently you went to London. As Herman and others have said, we should have been occupying that planet.
David, my observations from the United States are a little bit different. I think that since September, there has been more interest and collaboration between unions and the people you call youth and Occupy than I have ever seen in my entire life. The reason that Occupy retained the space in Zuccotti Park for 2 months was that when the mayor called the police, the unions called their members, and they showed up. And the reason that the October 5th march over the Brooklyn Bridge was as both shocking and successful as it was, is that there are so many labor union members there. I have been to labor meetings where old-time labor leaders explain to the assembled group what a spokes council is. No, I don't know where that will go. I'm not making any prediction about co-join movement. Most of the movements that I've been part of over a very long time have had very deep fissures in them, very deep conflicts in them. And I think this one will, I think there's a conflict between the longshoremen and Occupy Oakland that hasn't yet been healed. So yeah, there are going to be conflicts, but there is also a greater sense of common stakes than I have ever seen between labor and youth. You got to go back to the anti-war movement to remember hard hats against students.
Greg, do you want to make a final point?
About the precarious workers, there's an interesting figure that we always used to invoke about the informal sector in the South, which was about 50% of people being in the informal sector, with about 70 or 80% growth of new employment in the informal sector, so that number was expanding. Those literally are the numbers in the advanced capitalist core coming out of the crisis right now. That's the numbers that we're facing. So it's kind of, this kind of informalization in terms of precarious work is astonishing. And given the nature of the crisis, this is going to continue on for a long phase. The numbers for young people are just unbelievable to look at when we're looking at Europe, with youth unemployment rates. When we're talking youth, they're generalizing it sometimes to people in the 30 up to 35, youthful to me, but not general. And those numbers are often 50% right now. So this is astonishing numbers. I think I just wanted to respond a little bit to Saeed's point about the reform. I think that's very difficult right now. One of the problems we have had is what was put on the reform agenda through the 1980s and 90s from social democracy of a high value-added, high skilled training strategy just didn't work. And it didn't work for a lot of technical reasons and social and political reasons. And social democracy became incorporated in neoliberalism. We now confront the fact that most of the European countries, and the same thing works in North America, have more or less formed common fronts with the parties of the right behind austerity. That space is limited. Now, the two of the options being put forward have huge obstacles. The more reform-oriented one of the Keynesian reflation has a lot of technical difficulties, as well as a lot of political difficulties even putting it together. As we see Europe try to negotiate its way out of the fiscal compact, and they're going to have incredible political and technical difficulties trying to find a reflationary strategy. The other option is of course, putting more centrally on the question of nationalizing the banks. I don't see that being any less of an obstacle in this moment than that so-called reform one of a reflationary strategy. And I think then the other reforms we have to think about, I think, are concrete, which have to do with a lot of the way ecological issues have to link up to a left strategy at this moment. And again, those are big political struggles. We haven't had a reduction in work hours for 40 years as well. That's a central issue for precarious work. It's a central issue for an alternative exit strategy. And it's an incredible political obstacle when we're moving in work hours of the polarization, precarious work and longer hours. Similarly, in public transit, less commodified spaces, all those things are big obstacles. And that's why I think, you know, this is not really the issue of being what it means to be practical is I think, meaning having a really big imagination and a big agenda.
One of the reasons Occupy is important, especially in this sort of post-occupation phase when it is moving into the communities, is that it's an ally of the poor. The poor need allies. Who doesn't need allies? But especially people who have been subject to such abuse and such degradation, and so publicly for 40 years, need allies. So I am actually rather hopeful that we will see much more activism from poor people and working poor people in the coming months.
On your behalf, David and Fran, especially Fran for coming all the way up here, it obviously was worth it. I want to say one thing about people who are very precarious in our society, and that is independent left booksellers. You know, Leftwards reflects the continuing commitment of a remarkable group of people whose life situation is far less precarious than us petty bourgeois academics, and than most trade union activists and leaders.
You mean far more?
Far more precarious. And as increasingly private bookstores and left-wing bookstores in particular, independent bookstores, close down and shrink, an event like this is really crucial for their continued existence. So, you know, by all means go and buy the Register, because the Register is full of great stuff, and buy Francis Fox Piven's books, because who's afraid of Francis Fox Piven? But really, it's very important that the people who are in that book room get some sense that they're supported out of putting on this event. Thanks all for coming, and I hope we'll see you at the Register.